got the power? Equal power. Who got the power? We got the power. Who's got the power?
And what was important was that the Fair Work Commission expert panel found that the work of these workers, which is a predominantly female sector, has historically been undervalued because of assumptions based on gender.
Hello and welcome back to Collective Voices, the podcast from the International Trade Union Confederation. I am Stefania Cîrlea and this is Back to Basics, the podcast series where we are exploring the fundamental workers' rights. In our previous episode, we looked at forced labor, the most extreme denial of rights where workers are trapped in conditions that they cannot escape or refuse. But forced labor doesn't appear out of nowhere. It is often fueled by discrimination, when workers are judged not on their skills or their performance, but on other factors like their gender, race, disability, or migration status, among others. That's why in today's episode, we are focusing on the right to be free from discrimination. We will understand what discrimination at work looks like, why it persists, and how unions are working to build more inclusive workplaces. To guide us through this conversation, I am joined by my colleague, Maria Tsirantonaki, Policy Advisor in the Equality Department at the ITUC. Maria, welcome to the show.
Hi, Stefania, and thank you for having me today.
To start us off, Maria, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you do around this issue?
So indeed, I'm a policy advisor in the Equality Department of the International Trade Union Confederation. And our department mainly works on issues that relate to non-discrimination in the world of work. And in particular, we are focusing our efforts to support our affiliates around the world to address inequalities and discrimination based on several grounds, such as gender, race, age, sexual orientation, and gender identity, migration status, disability status, indigenous status, and other grounds, as well as multiple and intersecting discrimination. But we also try to ensure that trade union voices are included in policy development and decision-making. So what decisions governments are taking both when it comes to adopting new laws, regulations, legislation, and other policy measures.
It's clear from your introduction that discrimination is not just one issue. It can be based on multiple factors, and your work touches upon all of them. So let's take it back to basics. What does discrimination in the workplace actually look like, and who tends to be most affected by it? And also, before you answer, you mentioned two terms, which I think for me and the public can be a bit too technical, which are multiple and intersectional discrimination. Can you also please explain the difference between them and why that distinction matters in the workplace?
Discrimination at work can take really many forms and can affect workers in many different ways. So, for example, workers who might be facing discrimination at work may be belittled at the workplace, may be paid poor wages, and for some will mean even be paid below minimum wage levels. They might be bypassed for promotion or even refused training opportunities. And many may be even denied a job. So there is research and evidence collected by trade unions that suggests that indeed the gender discrimination in particular continues to be an important structural barrier for millions of women globally. But not only women are facing discrimination. So we also have migrant workers, racialized workers, disabled workers, or LGBTI workers who are also severely affected by discrimination at work. So indeed, when it comes to multiple and intersecting discrimination, I will just give you an example. Women migrant domestic workers may face discrimination in the world of work on a combination of characteristics. So they might be affected by discrimination because of their sex, their race, their ethnicity, their national origin, and their social status. So there are many grounds of discrimination that are interplay there and amplify their situation of vulnerability in the world of work.
Yeah, it is clear from what you explained that discrimination can affect not only getting a job in the first place, but being treated fairly and having the chance to progress afterwards. And as you said, when multiple forms of discrimination gather and overlap, the barriers get only heavier for the person suffering it. So can you share an example of how workers have fought discrimination in practice and what kind of impact it has had in their lives, but also if it was the case in society as a whole?
Yeah, sure. And maybe I will share an example that dates back to the 60s, which I think it's quite powerful and inspiring. This example relates to the 1963 Bristol bus boycott in the UK, which indeed paved the way for the 1965 and 1968 Race Relations Acts. So these acts actually banned employers from discriminating against a person because of the color of their skin. Prior to the bus boycott, Bristol Omnibus Company, run by the local council, wouldn't hire any Black or Asian people on its buses despite Bristol's Caribbean community. Therefore, no non-white driver or conductor had ever been employed on the network. So there were 3 West Indian activists who had formed an action group to fight discrimination, and they asked Paul Stephenson, was his name, to be their spokesperson. So Paul wanted to prove that the color bar was real. So he managed to get an interview at the bus company for a well-qualified young man called Guy Bailey. The day of the interview, when the sharply dressed guy arrived for the interview, staff at the bus company saw his black skin and sent him on his way before he had even sat down.
Wow.
So on the 29th of April 1963, Paul called a press conference to announce the Bristol bus boycott. The boycott was widely supported. There were sit-down protests and pickets. A couple of months later, on the 28th of August 1963, Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
This had an impact. In Bristol, on the very same day, the bus company promised a change in policy. So now there will be complete integration of the buses, and this followed a meeting of the Transport and General Workers Union the night before, where 500 bus workers had voted against the color bar. So indeed, the boycott was a big success. The month that followed, already by mid-September, there was the first bus conductor who was of Indian origin. And then the Harold Wilson's government brought in the Race Relations Acts, as I mentioned earlier, of 1965 and 1968.
Yeah, that story, it shows that fighting discrimination is so much more than getting fairness on your job. It's about building democracy and equality in our everyday life. But of course, these struggles that we're talking about, and despite the power of this story, the struggles of discrimination didn't end in the 60s. Workers nowadays are still organizing to challenge discrimination and win recognition worldwide. And I've read about a recent example in Australia where unions have won a major case for people working in elder care, which is a sector dominated by women. So can you walk us through that case and what happened there and why it matters so much?
Yeah, sure. That was quite a significant trade union victory for non-discrimination in Australia. And what happened was that the Health Services Union and the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation successfully brought a case before the Fair Work Commission in Australia, resulting in a landmark decision for aged care workers, and that happened in March 24. So the two unions had been campaigning for more than a decade to highlight how low staff-to-patient ratios and insecure hours, low wages, poor working conditions, all of these combined to cause a major staff shortage despite the growing need for elder care in Australia. So their efforts sparked a royal commission into aged care. and prompted the Fair Work Commission to raise wages in aged care by 20.9% to 28.5% over 3 years, so for the period 2022 to 2025. And these wages will affect direct care workers, so such as registered nurses, enrolled nurses, personal care workers, and others. And what was important was that the Fair Work Commission expert panel found that the work of these workers, which is a predominantly female sector, has historically been undervalued because of assumptions based on gender.
Yeah, it also shows how long-term organizing and persistence can pay off, even if it takes a longer time. And the fact that this victory in Australia is now improving the wages and conditions for thousands of carers. But not every battle has to go to court, as it was the case, right? I know that worldwide unions are working every day not only to fight discrimination, but to actively prevent it before it takes root. So can you tell us also a bit about that preventative work?
Yeah, sure. And I will mention 2 examples. So the first relates to pay discrimination. So trade unions have advocated, organized for the adoption of laws, policies to address many factors behind discrimination at work, such as in the case of the gender pay gap, which is still one of the most prominent forms of pay discrimination amongst women. So trade unions have been engaging in social dialogue and collective bargaining, demanding measures such as pay transparency, the adoption of equal pay and anti-discrimination laws, the adoption of family-friendly workplace policies, minimum living wages, measures to formalize informal work, to recognize, reduce, and redistribute care work to address the gender pay gap and close it. Another example relates to preventative measures concerning gender-based violence and harassment at work, which is also another form of gender-based discrimination. And I would like to talk about the Lesotho agreement. So in 2019, there were some important agreements signed to prevent and address gender-based violence harassment in garment factories in Lesotho. And that happened following an investigation by an independent auditor that indeed found widespread sexual assaults in factories. The agreements were signed by a major supplier of denim and 3 large apparel brands, as well as a coalition of Lesotho labor unions, women's rights organizations, and international workers' rights NGOs. So in the agreements, the supplier committed to a robust program to eliminate gender-based violence and harassment in Lesotho factories. So the program that was created was about to also include a body to investigate worker complaints on gender-based violence, harassment, and other appropriate remedial measures, and which the supplier had to implement. So all workers, including managers, had to be trained, and these multinational apparel brands were obligated to fund the program and use their economic power to ensure compliance. So the program has proved highly effective and decreased not just gender-based violence and harassment, but also other forms of harassment and bullying in the factories.
I was not aware of this case, so thank you for sharing that with us, because it shows how unions, together with their allies, can build workplaces that are safer for everyone. But of course, as powerful as these victories are, we know the problem of discrimination hasn't gone away. Many workers, especially those that are already marginalized, still face huge barriers every day. So let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. As the expert here, what more do you think needs to be done to make sure these workers are really protected?
Governments need to take action, employers, but also workers have an important role to play, as well as their representative organizations. And for workers affected by discrimination, the most effective strategy is to address their grievances to their trade union and seek remedy. So trade unions do play an important role. So they do ensure relevant laws and regulations are not just there in paper, but also they are effectively implemented and enforced at the workplace. So trade unions also fight to ensure, especially through collective bargaining, that there are special measures at their workplace concerning different categories of workers. That's also a key strategy, to include that workplaces are inclusive of people of all kind of different backgrounds. So the unions also play an important role when it comes to raising awareness and running campaigns to promote a culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the workplace. They also run training programs to promote non-discrimination at work.
Yeah, it's clear that progress is possible, and it is possible when workers and their unions don't give up, as you just said. So to end the episode on a hopeful note, what gives you the confidence that the fight is moving towards the right direction? And if you can give our listeners one simple advice on how they can make their workplace fairer for everyone today, what would that be?
So what gives me hope are indeed the many fights that trade unions are taking, both in the streets and in the workplace, to denounce discrimination and support those people who are affected. We see unions are joining with human rights activists, feminist movements, and other civil society organizations and progressive groups against the rise that we see nowadays of misogyny, xenophobia, racism, homophobia. So my advice to listeners is join a union if you haven't done so yet.
Thank you so much for your advice, Maria, and for being with us today. Your examples have shown us both the depth of the challenge and the power that unions have to fight discrimination and create fairer, more inclusive workplaces. Thanks.
Thank you, Stefania, for having me.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Collective Voices. In our next episode of Back to Basics, we will look at another fundamental right, the right to safe and healthy working conditions. We will explore what occupational safety and health, often called OSH, really means in practice, and how unions are protecting workers both in their daily workplaces and in the face of wider risks like pandemics or the climate crisis. If you found this conversation useful, please subscribe, share this episode, and stay connected for more insights on how we can shape a just and equitable future through collective action. See you next time.